When we talk about the performance of retail shopping centers, we have to consider the performance of retail sales. And to consider the performance of retail sales, you need to talk about the financial condition of the households that drive the consumer spend that drives that retail sales. Now, when we look at 2020, it's safe to say that the consumer took a massive income knock. And that was largely due to a big recession, 7% dip in GDP growth or negative growth rate during the course of last year. And with that, a big loss of jobs and portions of incomes for many, self-employed or people who lost discretionary rewards working for employers, etc. Now, just to give you an idea of the extent of the magnitude, during the second quarter of last year, GDP, real GDP, dipped by 17.8% year on year. That is massive. It's probably the biggest in most people's lifetimes. It's recovered somewhat, if you could call it that recovery, to a negative growth rate still of minus 4.1% by the fourth quarter of last year. With it went the labor shedding, understandably. Many businesses under pressure or even closing their doors. So employment dropped by 13.3% year on year in the second quarter and was still down 8.5% year on year by the fourth quarter of last year. So one doesn't need the numbers to know that that would be a big drop in income for the household sector and for the consumer, in other words. An extra minor drag was the further increase in the effective tax rate. The total tax value of the total personal tax levied on or collected on households as a percentage of disposable income rose yet again. It has been for some years, but that was very much a sideshow. The big source of pressure was income loss from the economy. There were, however, some cushions that partially cushioned the blow. Now, you may not notice it, but you would have noticed it would be far worse if these cushions weren't there. And there were two of them. The one was the low inflation rate. CPI inflation round about or just above 3% year on year. This is a very big difference from the global financial crisis back in 2008-9, where CPI inflation rose almost to 10% at one stage, driven by a global food price inflation shock and a global oil price inflation shock. Now, that didn't happen this time around. So we've got relatively low inflation, and that means that the cost of living doesn't eat, or the growth in the cost of living doesn't eat into disposable income growth as much. And when you translate it into real terms, that cushions the blow. So that was useful, but it was useful for another reason too. The low inflation rate enabled the Reserve Bank, with its inflation target, to cut interest rates by 300 basis points during the course of last year. And that had a massive impact in cushioning the blow for businesses, indebted businesses, and indebted households too. So the effective interest rates on household debt came down by near to 300 basis points. And the so-called debt service ratio, the interest cost on the debt burden of households as a ratio of overall disposable income, came down near to 2 percentage points, despite the indebtedness of households actually rising at the moment. When I refer to indebtedness of households, I'm referring to the household debt to disposable income ratio. It's ominously rising. It's not a healthy sign, but the blow was cushioned by this big drop in interest rates. That's helped tremendously. The household sector, though, is not falling entirely for low interest rates and not going out and spending massively on cheap credit in the consumer goods and services markets. Rather, it's becoming possibly more conservative at the moment. And we say that because we see a rising trend in the savings rate, believe it or not. From around about 2013, when the net savings rate was minus 2.5% of disposable income, in other words, it was negative, net to savings we call it. What that means is that the gross savings rate was insufficient to cover the cost of depreciation on fixed assets, a calculation done by the Reserve Bank. That has gone into positive net savings territory to the tune of 1.4% of disposable income. It's not a wonderful number. It needs to be far higher in the longer term for financial sustainability. But while it's rising, it poses something of a minor further negative to retailers. You're cutting back. You're trying to cut back on consumption or curb your consumption spend growth to save more. Good for the long term, but not good for retailers and shopping centers in the short term. But that's very much of a sideshow. The reality is that household disposable income in real terms was down in the fourth quarter by minus 4.8%. And the biggest driver of that, I believe, was the employment loss, the overall income loss as a result of that, and that GDP that's down still in the fourth quarter by a similar minus 4.1%. So it's still a financially pressured consumer. That last bit of recovery in employment back to what it was pre-lockdown, and income and economy all taking their time and probably set to take a significant amount of time, because when we had that big recessionary knock and the shutdowns, a portion of businesses, let's not say many, that's subjective, but a portion of businesses, a portion of the production side of the economy shut its doors, is not coming back. Business confidence is very low. So the businesses that exist are not quickly expanding their capacity to fill the void, taking on more people, etc. And new businesses don't just start up overnight. So it's a long, slow process back to recovery. And with real household disposable income growth still in negative territory late last year, that by and large explains why real retail sales growth has still been in mildly negative territory as at late last year and early this year.